Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining Coalition's monthly webinar series. My name is Jen McPhillips, and I'm going to be moderating our discussion today. And today we're going to be talking about Coalition's underwriting engine and how we use all of the sort of data and signals in our underwriting process to assess our insureds the way that an adversary would. I'm excited to introduce two of my colleagues who are going to be joining me for this conversation today. So first, we have Tom Bonello. Tom has over 20 years in the security industry, and he's led teams across a bunch of names you'll probably recognize in security, including Microsoft, Symantec, and AppRiver. And Tom is now on our team heading up product and partnerships for the Binary Edge product line. We're also joined by Sean Ram, who is the head of insurance for Coalition. Prior to this, Sean spent his entire career as a broker, and he was previously responsible for Aon's technology clients globally. He was also a part of the founding team at Coalition and is responsible for insurance operations across the team, which includes underwriting, distribution, and claims. So before we get into the content itself, I just want to make a quick note about Zoom. So if you see at the bottom of your screen, there will be two icons there, a chat icon and a Q&A icon. And we'd love for you to submit questions throughout the presentation using one of those two features. Thank you as well to those of you who submitted questions ahead of time. And I'll be fielding questions throughout the conversation, but we'll also reserve some time at the end to go through kind of in detail the questions that you guys have submitted. So just a recap on who we are. Coalition is the fastest growing provider of cyber and technology insurance in the US and now in Canada. We provide up to 15 million USD, 20 million Canadian dollars of insurance. And we also provide our policyholders with a comprehensive set of security tools that includes proactive monitoring and alerting, really with the goal of helping our customers manage and prevent cyber risk. And we have some backers listed at the bottom: Swiss Re, Lloyd's, and Argo Pro. So for today, again, we're talking about how Coalition underwrites our clients like an adversary would. So we're going to talk about how we approach underwriting in a unique way and sort of all of the data that goes into our underwriting process. Then we're going to do a deep dive into the technology itself. What are the things that we're scanning for, and how do we use that to actually price each individual insuring agreement and the risk that we're observing. And then we'll be doing a demo of our actual scanning technology, kind of give you a view under the hood of how our scanning platform works. And then finally, we'll leave some time at the end to go through questions. All right, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sean, to talk about our underwriting approach.
Thank you, Jen. Appreciate the opportunity to be on the webinar and tell you a little bit about how we underwrite. As Jen mentioned, our plan is, what I'd like to do is just give you a brief overview of kind of how we think about Coalition and our underwriting process. We'll then kind of show you the technology, and we'll come back together and I'll describe how the technology really assists us make risk-based decisions. The first slide that I like to demonstrate is kind of how we think about our underwriting engine, and specifically how it kind of correlates to individual insuring agreements. Today, we're going to show you some technology that demonstrates kind of loosely termed our ability to scan the internet and capture underwriting variables. That in and of itself is interesting and useful and highly differentiated. However, given the audience for our call, I do want to just make the connection to insurance. So as you take a look at this diagram, to start at the bottom, we hope to demonstrate today all of our data collection efforts, right? And as we collect data across the internet on millions of companies and their technology profile, and correlate that to security-related risks, and specifically cyber insurance-related risks, we capture a tremendous amount of data. All of that data in a business that is based on actual science allows us to do some really interesting things. First of all, it allows us to have an underwriting model where we very actively connect security-related risks to insuring agreements. I remember as a broker, kind of this idea, I'd like to use an example, to have $100 million hospital on one side of the street with, let's call it 5 million records of PHI. And the underwriting community underwriting it in a certain fashion. And then you have another company on the other side of the street that's a $100 million hospital with $5 million records. And because of the similarities of those two unique variables, the underwriting community underwrote them exactly the same. The price was identical. The coverage was identical. Well, then invariably you have one of those clients approach you and say, hey, I just invested all this money in my security risk, right? To analogize this to the property, I installed all these sprinkler systems. I've done, I have all these kind of walls in place to prevent fires. And I'd go to the underwriting community and it would just be the same, right? So unfortunately, too often in cyber, the risk is not always connected to the premium or the coverage. At Coalition, because of the data we capture, we're very focused on connecting those two dots, so we have improved underwriting. The data also enables us to actively risk engineer. Now that's a term that we use to describe our security tooling and the work we do to support clients in helping them mitigate against their security related risk through all of the tooling. And we'll spend a bit more time on that. And then finally, all of that data also enables us in a claim scenario. When a claim occurs, that data enables our incident response team to show up at the claim prepared, already fully aware of what is occurring within the client's network to assist them and help them get the adversary out. Well, the combination of those experiences on the left-hand side of this diagram drive lower losses. Well, that's fantastic, right? If our client base and our tens of thousands of policyholders have lower losses, well, that's enable us to deliver a better product to you. Superior pricing and better coverage. We hope that as we provide better pricing and better coverage, that enables even more customers, which obviously improves our data, thereby kind of completing the feedback loop. On the next slide, I attempt to display this in a little bit of a different fashion, just to kind of describe the value of what this provides to policyholders. So as many of you are aware, Coalition has, 65% of our employees are in the engineering space, right? With profound security expertise from the government, as well as security providers throughout the country. Couple that with all of the data collection efforts that we're going to show you here in a minute. That enables us to focus on something that we believe is our mission as a company, which it may be very easily to assume that our mission may be to collect premium, but our actual mission is to solve cyber risk. And the culmination of security expertise with data collection, along with the insurance expertise, puts us in a position where we're able to correlate the risks that a company has to insurance. What we're going to show you today is a lot of our data collection efforts. It's important to note that these data collection efforts are not happening in isolation. This is our underwriting model. It is specifically how we connect the security profile of an account to the premium, to the insuring agreements. And then as we do that, as these two collective efforts come together to correlate risk and model, it enables us to do some really special things in the world that we believe policyholders and brokers will find very valuable. So at the bottom, you can see we're able to have specific insights about how to prevent future losses at a very specific level and say, you are using this specific technology, which creates risk in the following way, and this is how you fix it, becomes really interesting. It also enables us to understand kind of the landscape of threat actors. What are adversaries doing? How are they doing it? Again, what can we do to prevent it? The ongoing monitoring is continuing, and then finally, our efforts to step in before, during, and after a claim enables us to reduce the risk and mitigate against it. And so I'm really excited that whether it be across our thousands of policyholders and the data we collect, or simply our attempt to collect information outside of the 75,000 submissions or so that we receive annually, our ability to collect all that information and use it to benefit you and the policyholder is really important to us. Jen, with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. And now I'm going to hand it over to Tom, who's going to do a deep dive discussion of how we actually collect that data. He's going to first sort of explain in simple terms what we're looking for in our scanning technology, and then give a demo itself, a demo of the technology scan itself. So Tom, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Jen. Excellent. Welcome, everybody. Appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy day to get a little understanding of what we're doing at Coalition. So kind of the first thing we talk about, and just maybe on the next slide, Jen, would be, what differentiate, what are some of the key things that are differentiating what we do when we talk about our technology scan, right? First and foremost, we have to be accurate. And when we talk about accuracy, it's really about understanding our ability to all the internet-facing assets of an organization, right? Because most of the risk that a company faces is coming from the outside. Sure, there's insider threats and issues, but a majority of the risk from a cyber perspective is really from threat actors outside in, right? So the first thing we need to do is accurately identify all of the internet-facing assets, right? So we put a lot of effort on that front, and we use the term enumerate, right? So we start with typically a single domain for an organization, and from there we enumerate out and build up a list of everything that's related to that company. And it's both IP addresses and domains specifically, because those are two things that we can then scan against and collect information about potential risks associated with each of those assets. We also focus on really doing that from a single domain, right? Because again, as many of you know, with the Coalition process, we've also tried to make it as easy as possible, right? The bare minimum amount of information we need to collect from a broker or an end user to kick off that quote, right? We want to make it as simple as possible. So we really focus there a lot of the effort. Second is speed, right? Again, as part of that experience we want the end user to have, right? We want a faster underwriting process. We want quick results. And then we also back that up in terms of the monitoring process, right? So we have what we also call our on-demand scanning capabilities, which is really doing that deep data retrieval from monitoring that we do, right? But again, to scale out, we need that to be fast because we're supporting organizations of all different sizes and number of assets that we need to scan and understand the metadata from. The fact that we have this good accuracy and the speed to get through that really also sets the table for our ability to scan or assign risk or understand risk around organizations of any size, right? The traditional tools that were out there for creating risk for a company were really heavily focused on large enterprises, right? A lot of effort went through to deeply understand all those large enterprise assets, build out tables, et cetera, right? But those doesn't scale as you want to move down to companies of different sizes. On our side, we've actually came up with a ground up approach in terms of our architecture. So we can scan, a single person company, a 10,000 person company, those magnitudes all in the same way. And what we're going to do is I'm going to take you through a couple more simplistic slides to kind of discuss, the key part of scanning a company is their domain and IP addresses. So I'm going to take you a little bit and kind of set the table for what we're doing or, what IP addresses and ports are, so that when I demo the product and really show you all the data we've collected about a company, it'll make sense. If we, so move, go ahead.
Quick question on this point before we move on to the explanation. A question came in asking if a company has affiliated entities under a common parent company, a common domain, are we still able to identify the domains for those affiliated entities?
Absolutely. We've actually, again, for us, enumeration has been a big ongoing process, and we've built it up over time so that literally starting with just that main head, the main HQ or the main top level domain or company, we can absolutely get all the different subsidiaries. We're actually working on something right now where without even a domain, just starting with that main company name, we're going to also be able to do the enumeration, right? So again, really taking a lot of different variables out of the picture, right? Because again, from an underwriting perspective, you don't want to have to require the end user to input all those different subsidiaries, all those different domains to try and figure out all the assets of the organization that we're trying to insure. Great. Any other questions before we start moving on? Great. So again, as I kind of mentioned, most of the risk comes from the outside, right? So what we try to do is we try to take an outside in view of an organization, right? So that we're seeing that company the same way that the threat actors or hackers are looking at an organization, right? So the best way to think about this is what we're, the technology we do is we scan every IP address, right? And think of an IP address as analogous to your house address, right? So, the first thing the bad guys are looking to do is understand, where do you live, right? So the IP address identifies, essentially the address for your the entryway to the internet, right? Now, to communicate, or for applications or services to communicate in or out of your IP address, there's something called ports, right? So the best way to think of a port is like windows and doors, right? You go in and out, you go in and out your doors, stuff comes in and out of the windows, right? So with that, that analogy there, you can understand, the bad guys are looking to basically go to every house and check to see, what doors or windows are potentially open, what can they exploit to get in, right? And maybe get into your house. So what we do from a data collection perspective is we're constantly doing worldwide scans of the entire internet, right? So we're checking every IP address and looking to see if there's any open ports on those, on the IP address. If there's an open port, we can then collect data about the applications or services that are living behind those ports, right? So kind of examples of, applications that maybe live, behind an IP address. Think of like a website, right? Websites live on port 80, right? All data comes in and out of port 80 if you're hosting your own websites. And more importantly, the one that probably everyone hears a lot about is remote desktop access, right? Or RDP, which lives on port 3389, right? Again, it's how, if you're going to remote in, especially now with everyone working from home, they need to connect to the home office. They typically want to just remote into their desktop machine over that protocol. So if we look at the next slide, right? So now that we've kind of collected all this information about what ports are open, essentially all the doors and windows of a house, the next thing we have to ascertain is how risky are each of those doors and windows, right? Or the ports or the applications running behind them, right? So think of the risk level of an organization like the locks on the doors and the windows, right? So, if someone's running RDP, RDP has a lot of vulnerabilities, most namely, like everyone's probably heard of BlueKeep, which was a lot of announcements about earlier this year, right? So super easy for the bad guys to get in and install ransomware, through RDP, BlueKeep vulnerability. So what you want to think of there is the RDP vulnerability is much like a very simple padlock that could just be opened with a paper clip, right? So what we find, not only on our side are we scanning and understanding all the internet, but we're also listening to seeing what the bad guys are scanning for. So an example is that with RDP, every week we see over 500 million, if you will, lock checks across the internet, right? Because that's the easiest thing for them to get into an organization is via RDP. So the bad guys are constantly probing and checking and seeing, does anybody have, that RDP lock on their door? Because if so, then they're going to try and get into that organization. So again, what we're able to do is, as we scan and collect the data about each port, what application or services exposed on a port, we then can check it against the known vulnerability database, or you may have heard the term CVE, the Common Vulnerability Exposures Database, right? So for every application or every service that has a known vulnerability, we can then assign a risk level to it, right? So in the past, some big name ones were the Citrix NetScaler vulnerability that came out a couple months ago, right? That was, again, another high risk because it was easy to exploit. So what we do is, as we understand all the assets of the organization, we then can assign a risk around each of those applications or services that we find. So we talk a little bit about, maybe on the next slide, we'd actually talk about, all the assets we find, right? I was kind of focusing on, that single house or organization, but the reality is most companies have multiple addresses, right? They have multiple exposure points to the internet. And so this is where, could be your affiliates, your subsidiaries related to the organization, depending on the type of company you are. But one of the other more interesting things that you also need to be aware of, and something that we address with our enumeration, right, is kind of what, I'm showing here in the picture, from the house analogy or the company analogy of the WeWork, the shared office space, right, where you have employees that go into a shared space, right? Well, from an application perspective, many companies are now putting applications in Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, or Amazon Web Services, right? So when you put applications in one of those cloud service providers, those aren't your IP addresses, those aren't your domains, right? But as part of our risk and our technology, when we enumerate an organization, we're still able to identify these third-party cloud organizations as quote unquote, your address space, right? So we scan those and understand, do you have any vulnerabilities that are potentially exposed on the applications you're also running in that shared space, right? So, a big part of what we have to focus on is actually getting through, not what you would think of as your traditional entryway to the internet, but all those potential spots of how a company is exposed. And like I said, we then, once we have that full assets or understanding of all the assets, we understand all the applications, we match it up to the risk, and that's what feeds the underwriting engine. All those components of the data that can then, make a smart quote for the cyber insurance policies. So I just want to do a little bit of overview of that. Jen, is there maybe any questions when I'll switch over to the demo and actually take everyone through the product?
Yeah, one clarifying question came in about the ability to enumerate affiliated entities, and I think we addressed it on this slide, but just to reiterate that we're able to enumerate all of the affiliates for the parent company and the services that they're using that even are not part of the entity itself, as Tom mentioned. So hopefully that addressed that question. One other question just came in clarifying what some of the differences are between how we scan versus others. And I think, Tom, you'll address this in some of the demo here, but if you could maybe address that quickly before you go in.
Right. Again, just some of the big key part is, again, how we go through and do the enumeration of the entities first, right? To really build out the asset map of a company, right? And then part of our architecture too, in the actual scanning that makes it fast, is there's all different types of applications and services. So we've written special modules for each type of application and service that can sit behind one of those ports, right? A lot of people probably hear about data breaches, right? Elasticsearch databases that are exposed, or MongoDB databases, right? We have specific modules for each one of those types of databases, so that when we see the open port and we identify, hey, it looks like there's an Elasticsearch database, we can then reach in and pull out the appropriate metadata to say, is that database properly protected, right? Does it have, it can be sitting on the internet for, a public application that needs to serve up data, but is the proper authentication in place? Or is it the data just sitting wide open and exposed? So by digging into that deeper data, but behind each of the potential vulnerable applications, we can associate the risk with that, right? So two companies could both have Elasticsearch sitting on the internet. One could be properly secured. It's going to be low risk or no risk. Another one could be wide open. Obviously, it's going to be high risk and critical, right? So those depth of modules that we have, and then we run a lot of that module scanning across the companies and across the internet in parallel. That's what gives us the speed that we need to make fast decisions. So with that, I'm going to kind of dig in, and what I'm actually showing you here is a productized version of the technology we use in-house at Coalition, right? So we're bringing this product to market as attack surface monitoring, and it's something that we're going to make available in a limited version to insureds. So again, they can kind of look at themselves, or if they want to look at some other companies and understand some risk, maybe some vendors or supply chains, they'll be able to do that. But more prominently as well, we're going to be selling this to large enterprise organizations that, again, can use and take advantage of the security technologies we've developed for ourselves to benefit them. So when you first, if I was internal to Coalition right now, I would be looking at this screen, and on the scatter plot, I would be able to see every insured company, right? And basically, I get a heat map of the security risk around each organization. Obviously, to keep it simple, I've just loaded up some key demo companies on my dashboard today. But if I highlight over a company, I can quickly ascertain what's the risk behind that, right? So as Sean mentioned before, our risk engineering team, right? They use this tool if there's any questions, or if there's, during the ongoing monitoring process, if something kicks up, we're able to quickly dig into an organization and say, well, why are they popping up with a critical? What's showing up with that organization? All right, so it gives just a very high level view. The right side here, this is showing me just the average risk around all my organizations that I'm monitoring, right? So again, for Coalition, it gives us a quick view of, are we looking really, do we have potential, too much risk out there, or is the risk where we want it to be very quickly? And then again, I can get a quick list of, all right, who are my most risky organizations? Maybe who are the ones that we should work with, or provide some additional information about, hey, these are the kind of things you should be cleaning up or addressing. But now I'm going to, take a dig in and actually start showing, by walking through what we've collected for a company, or walking through one of the companies, you'll kind of see all the different types of data we collect and use in the decision-making process, right? So I'm going to take one, and again, I'm not picking on anybody. It just happens to be, one of the higher ones out of my little subset today. So when we look at an organization, again, we start out in a summary view. Every time the company gets scanned, we'll fill in another box here, so we can quickly mouse over and understand, okay, is their risk getting better or worse over time, right? So again, maybe it comes time for renewals next year. We see that an organization trending down, that their risk has gotten better. Hey, they're favorable for renewal again, right? If it's going in the other direction, maybe Sean and the team are having a little conversation before they decide on the renewal, or the rates get adjusted accordingly. Again, some high-level information that a risk engineer can just use to quickly understand. But let's dig in and start really looking at what we've collected. As I mentioned, one of the first things we do is we need to enumerate the company and understand all the applications and services that are running at that organization or exposed to the internet. All right, so the first thing we see here are, again, I mentioned some cloud services. So this particular organization has Office 365, right? So that's running on Microsoft servers in Microsoft's cloud, but it has the company's information. So we can look at that, understand if there's any risk around those applications. And then down here, these would be the applications that the company themselves are running. And then if needed, we can go through and look at every single asset we've enumerated for this organization. Obviously, this one has over 1,300, so I'm not going to go through each and every one today, but if we wanted to, we can look at it either from a domain perspective or from their IP address perspective, right? So we can spin it either way based on what we want to be researching or looking into. So that gives us information about the attack surface. Next, and the most important part about the risk is obviously looking at vulnerabilities, right? So again, to make it easy and quick to dig in on some of the key risk areas, we've created kind of these top level filters, right? So these are graphs to kind of indicate some big risky things, but at the same time, this organization had over 1,300 assets. I can't drill through every one. So if I want to get the 10 and look at the 10 expired assets with expired SSL, I can just click over here and quickly filter and get the 10 items that are at risk. I mentioned before, we talk about RDP obviously being the biggest and dangerous one. So let's use this one to actually drill in and see what RDP exposure looks like, right? So again, I've got open, right here, it's right in front of me and I don't have to hunt around. I can click on that particular asset. And now here's all the particular data I talked about before, right? So this is the, again, going back to the house analogy, here's the IP address. This is, we've drilled in on a single house, and now we're seeing all the the doors and windows that were open for this organization, right? So they've got some web servers running, and they've got some RDP or, open desktop protocols open, right? I can get a different view of it by looking at the applications that are running, right? So there's, the Microsoft ISS, which is the web service, and then Microsoft Terminal Services, which is the actual remote desktop protocol application, right? So again, we've collected all this information as part of our scan. The security check, this is actually where we're doing that correlation, right? Between, hey, there's a version or application that's been found and what risk is behind it. And then the final proof, with RDP to show that it was open, we actually have a screenshot, we actually take a screenshot of the open desktop that was, sitting out on the internet. So that's kind of how we drill through and you can get a feel for some of the different data we collect. Now, another quick example I'd like to talk through, right, would be, we talk about new vulnerabilities coming out, right? I mentioned the CVE database, right? So a new vulnerability comes out, I don't know the number, but if I knew the exact number, but to keep the search simple, I could put in CVE, and then if I knew the specific number, I could call out that specific number and find all the CVE or the new vulnerabilities associated with that item, and see which companies of mine out of my list were at risk for a certain CVE. So again, I could then alert them, but more importantly, and what we use the platform for as well, is this, if any of you are recently getting notifications from Binary or from Coalition, we actually use this platform to send out those notifications as well, right? So this would be the version I'm going to sell, the end users can set up the recipients, but internally to Coalition, we're setting up those notifications for you and alerting either the insureds or the broker of potential issues that we're finding during the ongoing monitoring. So that's kind of a quick high-level walkthrough of the product and technology we're using within Coalition. Did we want to go through some more questions, Jen?
Yeah, a couple of questions came in specific to the notifications, and I'd love for you and Tom to weigh in on. Sorry, you and Sean to weigh in on this.
Yep.
So one question came in about whether we are communicating the notifications and the vulnerabilities that we observe on our insureds to brokers as well. And Sean, would love if you could address kind of what that notification process looks like to both policyholders and to the brokers that own the account.
Sure. That was a great question. It makes a lot of sense. As you think about this concept, this is the idea of approaching an insured and saying, hey, as an example, the sprinkler head in this particular area of your building stopped working. This is why it's a problem, and this is how you can go fix it. Just simply, we tell them what the problem is, what we see, why it's important to them, and then we inform them how to fix it. The other element about that is we inform them that Coalition is willing to help them fix it at no cost to the insured. And so particularly for a lot of the clients that we work with, hand-holding them through a process like this can be quite appealing, and it is all part of the services of Coalition. When we see a vulnerability, and by the way, there's lots of vulnerabilities that exist in the technology space. The idea of understanding which vulnerabilities are impactful are important. And so the risk scoring concept is important when it comes to vulnerability. So when we see one that we believe is important, in an automated fashion, we will notify the policyholder, as I just described. We'll also notify the broker. We want to partner with brokers and help them kind of understand as specifically as appropriate as the broker deems appropriate. Some brokers want to really get into the weeds and understand that, and we love that. And other brokers are like, great, thank you. This is what I always hoped you would do. We notify the broker so they're aware, and then we help the client wherever possible to help them solve the particular vulnerability that happened. This happens, as I mentioned, in an automated fashion. It happens all the time. I'll walk you through a specific example later in the presentation around one notable vulnerability that we kind of identified clients and how that process ensues. Now, the key question I think that follows on for this topic is that, well, what if the client doesn't do anything? What if they're like, hey, I ignored the email, or I didn't have the time or resources to give attention to it? We'll notify the client more than once about the vulnerability. Generally, we notify them kind of 2 to 3 times within a probably 2-month period, 6 to 8 week period. And at some point we're like, hey, no problem. To be 100% clear about this, if a claim arises due to the vulnerability, Coalition will respond to the claim just like we would have without the notification. So if it's something that's covered, we would cover the claim, like no issues there. What I generally say is we just simply would remember it at renewal. So just like anyone else, when a renewal comes around, we reassess the risks of the account, and then we would price and manage that renewal accordingly. But these notifications would not impact a claim scenario.
Just to reiterate one point on that. So when we're sending out notifications to our policyholders, you as the broker receive the notification at the same time. And there's sometimes certain information that we have to redact for security purposes, but you're getting the same information and you're understanding in real time what your clients are receiving from us. One other question, just while we're on this topic of notifications, are insureds getting notifications at renewal or throughout the year?
Yeah, so this Coalition's kind of the process that Tom has described, that's ongoing throughout the entire policy period. And so we provide notifications to policyholders throughout the entire policy period and not only at renewal.
Thank you. And Tom, I'll pass back to you for the last point on sort of what we share in the demo.
Right. So again, just to kind of reiterate, I think the key thing is, we're taking a good outside-in view of an organization, right? We're understanding every single potential asset, whether it's physically in their organization or within their companies, or if it's in cloud hosting, we're able to identify all the services and applications running there, match it up to potential vulnerabilities, and then complete the cycle by creating that awareness via notifications that something's there.
Jen, your screen, we lost your screen share.
1 second, let me pull it back up. Are you able to see now?
Yes, thank you.
Right. All right, now Sean is going to address in the last portion of this, just sort of, again, how all of this feeds back to our insurance product and how we think about connecting the underwriting and the scanning data that we just kind of walked through it in great detail to the insurance policy and the product that we offer.
Thank you. So Tom has just demonstrated all of Coalition's, well, not all, but we demonstrated Coalition's data collection efforts and how, you know, this concept of our desire and our ability to underwrite the entire internet, and then also our ability to underwrite a specific submission that you provide, or our ongoing efforts to underwrite policyholders and the ongoing monitoring that we have throughout the policy period. These three buckets are important to understand. So one, we underwrite everything we can on the internet. We scan, hundreds of thousands of IP addresses every day and do it hundreds of times in a broad data collection effort. Frankly, hundreds of millions. Second, when a submission comes in, we establish every understanding that we can of that account. We track everything associated with a loss run. We look back and say, hey, when did this loss occur? What was the technology profile of that account? What was happening in the marketplace at that moment? And then obviously with our policyholders, the ongoing monitoring and scanning efforts provides this very broad data collection effort. We then take all of that data and we correlate it to insuring agreements. So what this slide attempts to do is kind of highlight some of the things I'm referring to. But the point here is we collect data not in isolation. We collect data, one, to underwrite, two, to notify customers when problems occur, and then three, because it enables a process when a claim occurs where Coalition is able to move faster and with greater data accuracy and integrity than really any other entity because of our previously data collection efforts. On the next slide, I wanted to actually spend a bit more time around how this data helps us, right? And I know I've talked about this in various ways. Coalition's data collection efforts are not some isolated input, security score input that enters an underwriting model, a rating model. Coalition's data collection efforts are the underwriting model. It is how we attempt to, in a fact-based pattern, understand what policyholders are doing in their network, make assessments associated with risk, and then correlate them to premium. What this slide attempts to demonstrate is how we're doing that across the entire insurance value chain. So obviously Coalition is an MGA. We discussed our carrier partners, and I'll just use Swiss Re, our most notable carrier partner. So there's two things that Swiss Re does that are not on this slide, right? On the left-hand side of this slide, Swiss Re is managing everything regulatory related, right? Coalition, our product, is admitted in 48 states. All of the regulatory burden that is associated with a carrier occurs on the left. On the right-hand side, it's the management of capital, reserving, et cetera, which our carrier partners do as well, help us with. And although we provide a lot of value in each of those areas, in each of the areas that you see on this slide, it attempts to demonstrate where Coalition is specifically doing. And I'd like to overlay kind of the data collection efforts across each of these areas. So firstly, distribution, right? All of our data collection efforts enable you as a broker to rate, quote, bind, and issue a policy in minutes. Hopefully, for those of you that have worked with us, you've appreciated a really short application. More importantly, hopefully your clients have appreciated it. On the product side, obviously our ability to collect kind of tens of thousands of signals on any given account enable us to provide a policy that is unique to Coalition. With how much data we collect, you would expect us to have a superior policy in the marketplace. It also establishes this feedback loop, which occurs in every area of insurance, but really not in cyber, where our data collection efforts enable us to actually approach the claim in a significant fashion, whereby the majority of the insurance community hands a claim scenario to a third party. Because of Coalition's incident response services, we're able to use the data in a significant fashion to assist the client in a claim and operate very quickly. Underwriting. I've spent a lot of time on this, so I'm not going to go too much deeper in that. But obviously, this data collection effort, what we call our signals intelligence platform or system, enables us to underwrite at a speed that no one else really can, which is this concept of no human could analyze 100,000 signals on a given company in a matter of seconds, which our platform enables us to do. Risk engineering is the concept that because we collect all this data continuously, it enables us to then share the data with our policyholders. So if we detect a vulnerability, or conversely, let's say the Equifax breach occurred using a technology kind of primarily known as Apache Struts. So our ability to then recognize a breach that happens in the public, that's perhaps not even a policyholder of Coalition, and then actually go out and scan and look at our entire portfolio and proactively notify other customers who are using that same technology is pretty compelling. And then I've highlighted the value that data provides in a claim scenario, making our ability to notably assist quickly, resolve claims faster, frankly results in about 40% of the claims dollars not eroding the policy limit. To say that differently, because Coalition's incident response services all occur outside the limit, it enables your policyholder to have, on average, 40% more limit available to them at any given time during a claim. All right, go ahead and moving to the next slide. As many of you know, we provide all of this data to you as a broker through our cyber risk assessment. I shouldn't say all, because there's too much and we don't want it to overwhelm you. But on every submission that we receive from a broker that has a domain, this cyber risk assessment is available in your dashboard, which is a depiction of our data collection efforts. And then finally, Tom had mentioned this earlier. On the next slide, we just describe an experience that we had with this particular BlueKeep vulnerability. In May of 2019, we notified 50 customers that we believe were exposed to this Microsoft vulnerability called BlueKeep. This was a very serious one. Within a month of that occurring, actually what happened was within 2 weeks of this notification going out, there were 46 of the 48 customers that had solved this issue. Now, to be really open about it, I don't know if they did it because we notified them. They may have had their natural patch cycles and they may have done it on their own. I like to think we influenced that for some of them, but I just want to be open about that. We then sent an additional notification and notified the broker as well, as we did the first time. In that process, when we notified the customers, 2 additional customers had remediated this issue. Now, the end result is, as you see, 48 of the 50 solved the issue, but there's 2 that are outstanding. At that moment, now, a month into this, we then notified these 2 separate brokers and said, hey, look, we notified your client. This is something they haven't solved yet. Their renewals are coming up. I think one was in 5 months and one was in 9 months. It said, if this is still an issue at renewal, it will impact the renewal, right? And we're just as transparent as possible around it. I'm excited to be part of an organization that proactively notifies customers because we believe risk engineering matters. We think it's important that we do everything we can to solve cyber risk for a policyholder and not just give them an insurance policy. Jen, with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. And would love to go through some of the questions that have come in. And if you have a question, please, again, feel free to submit it through the chat feature or through the Q&A feature. So first question, and Sean, I think this one I'd love for you to address. What are some of the advantages of having your scanning connecting to the underwriting process?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's hard, right? As a broker, when your client approaches you and says, cyber risk is important to me, I'm doing everything I can to kind of solve this. Does it matter? Or I'm about to make this big investment in cybersecurity. My premium's going to change, right? The connection between risk and insurance is critical. It's necessary for our industry to evolve and to grow. It's necessary for underwriting and coverage to improve. And so having this ability to truly understand what is the risk profile of an account, and then deliver an insurance policy and services associated with that are directly correlated, I think is integral to this insurance process.
Thank you, Sean. Another question came in about how the data scanning that we just demonstrated, how we're able to detect things like emails that are coming in that have malicious links, or that, phishing emails that might be sent to employees. As the person noted, it's a very common form of attack. It's one of the most common forms of business email compromise. So the question is, how do we identify email vulnerabilities through our scanning technology? And Tom, I'd love for you to address that question.
Sure, right. So, as I was talking about, right, we do predominantly an outside-in view of the company, understanding all the services and applications and stuff that are in place, right? So relative to emails, again, because we're not inside the organization, we're not doing real-time scanning of each individual's user's computer, right? There's other tools that companies should have in place for that. One of the things we do, and I probably glossed over it pretty quickly as one of the apps that we detect, though, but we can determine if a company is running SPF, right, which is Sender Policy Framework, which is a tool that companies should have in place to help with it's one of the anti-phishing tools or anti-spam tools that you should have in place to help protect you from these kind of emails that would have malicious links in them. So we do it at some level with the ASM tool that we provide.
One other thing just on that point as well, as this individual pointed out, a lot of this risk comes down to employees and, making the right decisions and making sure that you don't accidentally click on a malicious email. One of the other things that we provide to all of our policyholders is free and discounted training, security training for all employees. And this is something that we as Coalition do for all of our employees, sending out some spoofed emails just to make employees get into the exercise of and the practice of confirming that emails are from an expected sender and that you don't click on a malicious link. So in addition to being able to detect some of those components outside in, like SPF, as Tom noted, the security training is another way for our policyholders to be able to complement their overall security program. Another question came in about admitted versus surplus lines. And Sean, I'd love for you to address this question. The question is, typically cyber has been written on non-admitted paper. So how do we think about the criteria for admitted versus surplus lines for the policy?
Yeah, great. I was actually responding to that via the messenger as well. It's interesting. So given the dynamic nature of our pricing, or of our risk assessment and underwriting model, dynamic meaning that it's real time, it's really hard to manage that in the admitted world, right? We are admitted in 48 states, and as many of you are aware, an admitted filing requires, an admitted paper requires a filing with the state, right? By the way, the only two states where we're not admitted is Alaska and Wyoming at the moment. So when you go to the state and you say, hey, here's our rating model for admitted, they accept it, right? Obviously 48 states accepted it, and it's great. Well, then what happens if the next week we start to see this massive trend of vulnerabilities and attack vectors associated with the particular segment of the market. Like, how do we manage that, right? It's hard. It's hard in an admitted world. So we believe that our surplus lines rating model is the most accurate depiction of risk for us. I'm not saying cheaper or higher, or cheaper or more expensive. I'm just saying it's the most accurate depiction of how we think about risk. What we do with the surplus lines filing is we update that all the time. We deploy our technology multiple times a week, and we're constantly attempting to better understand risks of a company and price for it appropriately. We then kind of, upon learning and growing and building that surplus lines model, we then aggregate that information and refile with states. Now, the process for refiling with states is long and burdensome. It can take upwards near 18 months at times. And so it's the reason why we believe the surplus lines filing is the most accurate. But obviously there's brokers that are focused in surplus lines and really value all the unique coverage and dynamic pricing the surplus lines offers. And there's other brokers that would rather not deal with the administrative burden of surplus lines and would rather place the policy admitted. We provide both options for our broker partners.
And important to note as well that regardless of the policy that the insured ultimately purchases, they get full access to all the security tooling that we've discussed, the security awareness training that I just mentioned, and the full access to Coalition's in-house response team. Well, I know we're just about at the top of the hour, so I think with that, I'll sort of bring us to a close. Thank you again for spending time with us this morning and for the thoughtful questions. We always appreciate the opportunity to share more about Coalition's data collection and underwriting processes. And just want to reiterate that we are available for you and for your clients 24/7. There's multiple ways for you to get in contact with us, but for regular questions, help@coalitioninc.com or .ca. And in an emergency or a claim scenario, we have this toll-free number at the bottom of the screen for you or your client to reach our claims and incident response team. And they typically respond within 2 minutes of receiving a call. So thank you again for your time and for your participation this morning. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.